Hi guys, and welcome to Bedtime History Relaxing. Tonight will you find yourself drifting back through time, not as a historian, not as a traveller with a map, but as a quiet observer standing at the edge of muddy riverbanks where something small, green, and unassuming begins to change everything. You probably won't survive this in the sense that once you understand how deeply this story shaped your dinner plate, you will never look at a simple bowl of rice the same way again. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now imagine where you are right now. Maybe it is late evening, maybe early morning. Tell me in your mind where you are watching from and what time it is outside your window. Now, dim the lights, flow straight into the story, no extra headings. You begin not in a grand empire, but in a quiet world of wetlands, where wild grasses sway in shallow water and wind moves through endless green edges of river and marsh. The air is heavy with moisture, carrying the scent of wet soil, algae, and slow decay. Somewhere in this environment, long before written language or cities, a wild ancestor of rice grows naturally, its grain small and fragile, almost invisible unless you know exactly where to look. At this stage, rice is not food in the way you understand it today. It is survival in its most uncertain form. Animals brush past it, birds scatter it, and seasonal floods decide whether it thrives or disappears. Yet early humans, moving cautiously along these river systems, begin to notice it. They do not understand agriculture yet. They only understand hunger, repetition, and memory. When something edible appears again in the same place each season, the human mind begins to file it away as important. A mainstream historical fact tells you that rice cultivation began roughly 10,000 years ago in regions of East Asia, especially along river valleys where water levels could be predictably managed. But in this moment, you are not in a civilization yet. You are simply watching the earliest instinct of selection form in the human mind. You crouch near the waterline, your fingers brush through shallow mud. Tiny grains cling to your skin. The texture is rough, slightly sticky, and oddly satisfying. You might not recognize it yet, but this is the beginning of one of the most important agricultural relationships in human history. Over time, something subtle happens. Humans begin favoring certain patches of wild rice that grow taller, produce more grains, or ripen in ways that are easier to collect. There is no formal system, no written instruction, only repetition across generations. A child watches an elder. That child repeats the action. Slowly, nature is being nudged into something more predictable. Here is where things become interesting. Because historians still argue whether rice domestication began in a single core region or whether it developed independently in multiple river valleys at the same time. The debate is not simply academic. It changes how we understand human cooperation with the environment itself. Was rice a single discovery that spread outward, or was it multiple human communities independently arriving at the same solution to hunger? You continue walking through these imagined wetlands. The soundscape is quiet but never empty. Frogs call from hidden reeds. Insects hum in thick air. Water shifts softly underfoot. Everything feels slow, almost meditative, as if the landscape itself is thinking in a different rhythm. A quirky tidbit often overlooked is that in some early cultures, rice was not only eaten but also used in ritual offerings and even early fermented drinks. Imagine that for a moment. A grain so small that it can be thrown into soil becomes something that also carries symbolic meaning, something shared between humans and the unknown forces they believed controlled harvests and rain. As generations pass, something profound begins to emerge. Humans stop simply gathering rice and start guiding it. They clear patches of land. They manage water levels in crude ways. They protect certain plants from being eaten by animals so they can return later and harvest more. This is not modern farming yet, but it is no longer pure foraging either. You are standing in the blurry transition between wild nature and human intention. The smell of the wetlands deepens in your imagination. It is earthy, slightly metallic, with a faint sweetness from decomposing vegetation. Your feet sink slightly with each step, reminding you how unstable this environment always is. Yet it is exactly this instability that made rice such a powerful partner for early humans. It thrived where many other grains struggled, and so quietly, without announcement. Rice begins its long relationship with humanity, not as a symbol of civilization at first, but as a repeated answer to hunger, season after season, memory after memory. You are no longer standing at the edge of wild wetlands. Now you're moving deeper into time, into a moment where human hands are no longer just noticing rice, but beginning to change it. The air feels warmer here, heavier with human presence. Smoke from small fires drifts through early settlements. The soundscape is different too. Instead of only birds and water, you now hear grinding stones, distant voices, and the steady rhythm of daily survival. Rice at this point is still not what you would recognize in a modern field. It is uneven, unpredictable, and dependent on seasonal luck. But something fundamental has shifted. Humans are no longer passive collectors. They are participants. You kneel with them in imagination. Early communities in Asia begin to experiment with something simple yet revolutionary. They save seeds. After harvesting wild rice, they deliberately keep the grains that look stronger, larger, or easier to collect. These seeds are not just eaten, they are set aside with intention. That single act changes everything. A mainstream historical fact tells us that early rice domestication likely involved gradual genetic selection over thousands of years, slowly transforming wild grasses into more stable cultivated forms. But in this moment, there is no science to explain it. There is only repetition, observation, and patience stretched across generations. The ground beneath you is still muddy, but now it is being shaped. Small clearings appear where vegetation has been cut back. Water is not just encountered anymore, it is managed in simple ways. People dig shallow channels with wooden tools, redirecting flow so certain patches stay wet longer than others. These are not yet engineered fields, they are experiments, fragile and uncertain. You might notice something subtle. The rice plants in these early cultivated spaces begin to behave differently. They stand more upright. Their grains cluster more tightly. Some varieties become easier to harvest because they do not scatter their seeds as quickly. This is not accidental in the long term. It is selection in its earliest form. Historians still argue whether this shift was driven primarily by human intention or whether rice itself, through natural variation, simply aligned with human activity in a kind of mutual adaptation. It is a debate that blurs the boundary between culture and biology. In truth, you are watching both evolve together. There is also something deeply human happening here beyond agriculture. You begin to see social structure forming around food. Families return to the same plots. Knowledge about where rice grows best becomes valuable. Those who understand the timing of water and planting gain quiet influence in the group. Rice is not just nourishment anymore, it is beginning to shape relationships. A quirky tidbit from early agricultural studies suggests that in some regions, rice fields may have been tended in communal cycles, where groups coordinated planting and harvesting in shared labour rhythms. Imagine the atmosphere, not industrial efficiency, but coordinated human presence, voices echoing across shallow water, feet sinking into mud, hands working together without written instruction. You step closer into one of these early fields. The water is shallow, reflecting a broken sky. Dragonflies hover above the surface. The smell is distinct, a mixture of wet earth, plant sap, and smoke from nearby fires. It is not pleasant in a modern sense, but it is alive in a way that feels immediate and essential. Each rice plant is still genetically close to its wild ancestor, but something has changed in how it is treated. Humans now return to it consistently. They protect it from grazing animals, they clear competing plants, they create conditions where rice has a better chance of surviving than other grasses, and slowly, without anyone planning it, rice begins to adapt more strongly to human life than to the wild. You walk through time and notice how this changes human behavior as well. Settlements become slightly less temporary. If rice can be expected to grow in the same place again next season, then there is reason to stay longer. Movement slows, memory deepens. The land becomes less of a passing landscape and more of a known partner. A mainstream historical fact is that this shift from foraging to early cultivation marks one of the most important transitions in human history, eventually leading to permanent agriculture and settled societies. But here, in this early stage, it is still delicate. One flood, one drought, one change in climate can undo everything. That fragility is always present. You feel it in the way people look at the sky. Weather is not background, it is authority. There is also experimentation happening without formal understanding. Some groups notice that planting rice in slightly flooded conditions reduces weeds. Others discover that transplanting young shoots can improve yields. These discoveries are not written down. They are remembered through practice, passed from hand to hand, from parent to child. You might notice a quiet moment at dusk. The field is still. Water reflects the fading orange light of the sky. Someone stands at the edge of the plot, not speaking, simply observing. In that silence, there is an awareness forming that this plant is becoming central to life. Historians still argue whether rice domestication was a conscious agricultural revolution or a slow unconscious drift shaped by necessity. Either way, what matters is that humans and rice are now locked into a shared trajectory, and as night settles over these early fields, you realize something subtle. The world is beginning to organize itself around a grain that most people today would consider ordinary, but here it is not ordinary at all, it is possibility. You move further forward in time, and the landscape tightens around you. The open wild wetlands are still present in memory, but now they are increasingly structured by human presence. River valleys feel less chaotic, more guided. Paths appear where repeated footsteps have pressed into soil. Smoke rises more regularly from clustered settlements, and rice, once scattered and uncertain, is now becoming a deliberate feature of survival. You are in the Yangtze River Basin, one of the most important early regions of rice cultivation. The air here is humid, almost thick enough to feel physical against your skin. Summer heat presses down, and even the wind seems slowed by moisture. In this environment, rice is not just useful, it is perfectly suited. You crouch at the edge of a young field. The plants are denser now, not uniform like modern agriculture, but clearly guided by human intention. The water is carefully maintained at shallow depth, enough to nourish seedlings but not drown them. Small embankments of mud and stone hold the water in place, forming the earliest recognizable shape of a paddy system. A mainstream historical fact tells us that the Yangtze River Basin played a central role in early rice agriculture, with archaeological evidence showing long-term cultivation and gradual domestication of Oryza species. But standing here, it does not feel like evidence. It feels like slow discovery repeated endlessly through lived experience. You notice how the people here move differently. Their daily rhythm is synchronized with water and growth cycles. Morning is for checking fields, midday is for repair and clearing, evening is for sharing food and observing weather patterns. Rice is not only planted, it is monitored like a living system. The soil beneath your feet is soft, almost sponge-like. Each step creates a faint suction sound as mud releases and reforms around your weight. The smell is rich and layered. Wet earth, decaying plant matter, and faint smoke from cooking fires blend into something unmistakably agricultural. It is the scent of early stability. Now you begin to see refinement. Early farmers notice that certain areas of the field produce better yields. They begin adjusting water levels with more care. Small channels are dug to redirect flow. Simple tools made of wood and stone are used to maintain bunds. The raised edges that separate water sections. This is no longer accidental cultivation. It is environmental engineering at a very early scale. Historians still argue whether rice domestication in this region was driven by gradual environmental management or whether human settlement patterns adapted around naturally favourable rice growth zones. The truth likely sits in between. Humans shaped rice, and rice shaped where humans could comfortably remain. You observe a subtle but powerful shift. Settlements are no longer purely temporary. People begin building slightly more durable structures near fields. Woven materials, clay reinforcement, and wooden frames appear. These are not cities yet, but they are no longer transient camps either. Rice has introduced the idea of staying. A quirky tidbit often mentioned in agricultural anthropology is that early rice farmers may have developed communal labour rituals not just for efficiency but for social cohesion. Planting and harvesting were not isolated tasks. They were collective events, reinforcing bonds within groups. Imagine dozens of people standing ankle-deep in water, moving in slow coordinated patterns, their reflections broken by ripples and sunlight. You move closer to one of these groups. Hands are submerged in water, gently pressing seedlings into soft mud. The motion is repetitive but not mechanical. There is conversation, occasional laughter, and the steady rhythm of shared labour. Children watch from the edges, learning without formal instruction. Knowledge here is not taught in classrooms. It is absorbed through repetition. Rice, at this stage, begins to influence not only survival but identity. Families become associated with specific fields. Knowledge of planting cycles becomes valuable social capital. The timing of rain is discussed with seriousness usually reserved for political decisions in later civilizations. You can feel the beginning of structure forming around agriculture. A mainstream historical fact tells us that irrigation and early water control systems were essential in transforming wild rice into stable crop production, enabling population growth in river valley civilizations. But what is often overlooked is how fragile these systems remain. A single flood can erase months of work. A drought can undo years of careful selection. You feel that fragility as you look at the sky. Clouds are not just weather patterns, they are uncertainty. Every change in wind direction carries consequences. People here understand the river not as a resource to be controlled fully, but as a force to be negotiated with. There is also something quieter happening beneath the surface of these fields. Rice is changing genetically. Plants that drop fewer grains when ripe are more likely to be harvested and replanted. Seeds that survive human collection cycles become more common over generations, without anyone consciously planning it. The plant is adapting to human preference. Historians still argue whether this domestication process was primarily human-driven selection or a co-evolutionary partnership where both species influenced each other equally. Either way, the result is the same. Rice is no longer entirely wild. As evening arrives, the light softens across the fields. The water reflects the sky like a fractured mirror. You see silhouettes of people moving along the bunds, checking water levels, repairing small breaks, and preparing for the night. Smoke rises gently, carrying the scent of cooked grains and herbs. In this quiet moment, you begin to understand something deeper. Rice is not just feeding these communities, it is organizing their time, their movement, and their sense of stability. Life is no longer scattered randomly across the landscape, it is anchored, and as darkness settles over the Yangtze Basin, you realize that something irreversible has begun. Humanity is no longer simply surviving in nature, It is beginning to build its life around a single plant that will eventually travel far beyond this river, far beyond this time, and quietly reshape the world. You continue forward, and the world around you begins to open again, but in a different direction. The rice fields of the Yangtze Basin are no longer isolated pockets of experimentation. They are starting to connect, stretch, and move outward like a living network following rivers, valleys, and human footsteps. The air feels less like discovery and more like expansion. You are now watching rice leave its original heartland. The movement is not dramatic. There are no grand migrations marked by banners or sudden collapses. Instead, it is slow, carried by people who carry seeds in woven bags, tucked into pottery or wrapped in cloth. A family moves upstream. A small group follows seasonal water patterns. A marriage links two settlements. Each movement carries rice with it. A widely accepted archaeological conclusion places early rice diffusion across multiple river systems in East and Southeast Asia through gradual migration and exchange rather than sudden expansion. But standing here, it feels less like diffusion and more like quiet companionship between humans and a plant that refuses to stay in one place. You walk along these early pathways. The landscape changes subtly as you move. Riverbanks become denser with vegetation. Humidity thickens, soil grows darker and richer. Wherever water lingers, rice finds a possibility. People here are no longer just learning how to grow rice. They are learning how to carry it into new environments. Some fields fail, others thrive unexpectedly. Success is not guaranteed. It depends on rainfall, temperature, soil texture, and timing that no one can fully control. You kneel at a newly attempted field. The soil is less stable here. Water does not behave as predictably as in the core river valleys. Yet rice still attempts to grow. Its resilience is quiet but persistent, like a memory refusing to fade. There is a lesser-known anthropological observation that early agricultural expansion often followed ecological corridors, where humans unknowingly moved along environments already partially suitable for domesticated crops. Rice is one of the clearest examples of this pattern. It does not force itself into every landscape, but it travels wherever water gives it permission. You notice something interesting in the human behavior around these new fields. There is caution. Every planting is an experiment. Every harvest is a question answered by nature. Success is celebrated quietly. Failure is absorbed and adjusted. Daily life becomes increasingly structured around this uncertainty. People begin to track seasons more carefully. They observe insect patterns, bird migrations, and cloud formations with growing attention. The rice plant has made humans observers of time in a more disciplined way. A widely cited archaeological interpretation suggests that rice cultivation contributed significantly to the development of early calendar systems in agricultural societies, as planting cycles required seasonal prediction. But here, there is no calendar carved in stone yet. There is only memory, repeated observation, and oral knowledge passed between generations. You step further into a humid valley where rice has recently been introduced. The fields are smaller, more fragmented. Bunds are less refined. Water management is still experimental, but something important is happening. Rice is surviving outside its original homeland. Now you begin to see a quiet transformation in tools. Wooden digging sticks become more specialized. Stone blades are shaped with greater consistency. Storage methods improve. People begin to think not just about harvest, but about preservation. How do you keep grain safe through unpredictable seasons? How do you store enough to survive failure? A small but important detail appears in early food systems research communities that successfully stored rice surplus gained stability that allowed population growth and settlement permanence. It's not just about growing food, it is about controlling time through storage. You sit with one of these early communities. The evening is calm, smoke rises from low fires. Rice is being cooked in simple clay vessels. The aroma is subtle but grounding. It carries warmth, starch, and the faint scent of earth. It is not refined cuisine, it is survival made edible. Children eat quietly nearby, adults speak in low tones. There is a sense of continuity forming, not just between people, but between seasons. Rice is no longer a seasonal event, it is becoming a rhythm of life. There is also a cultural layer emerging that is harder to define. Certain fields are treated with respect. Certain planting days are considered more favourable. Small rituals begin to appear around water and soil, not yet formal religion, but something close to reverence for cycles that determine survival. A lesser-known ethnobotanical observation notes that rice cultivation in early societies often coincided with the development of water-related symbolism and cultural practices. The plant becomes associated with fertility, continuity, and renewal. As you move through these expanding regions, you notice how rice subtly reorganizes space. Settlements cluster closer to fields. Movement paths become more predictable. Trade between nearby groups increases as surplus allows exchange rather than pure subsistence. A broader historical consensus recognizes that the spread of rice agriculture was a key driver in the formation of early complex societies across Asia, though the exact timeline and mechanisms remain actively studied and debated. But what is clear in this moment is simpler. Wherever rice spreads, human life becomes more anchored. You watch as the sun lowers behind layered hills. The fields reflect amber light, water becomes gold-tinted, almost glowing in the fading day. It is quiet, but not empty. You feel the weight of repetition, of thousands of small decisions accumulating across generations. Rice is no longer just a plant growing in wetlands. It is now a travelling companion of human civilization, moving outward, adapting, failing, succeeding, and slowly reshaping landscapes as it goes. And as night approaches again, you realise something subtle. The story is no longer about where rice began. It is about how far it is willing to go with humanity. You move further along the timeline, and the world begins to feel less like scattered experiments and more like something deliberately shaped. Rice is no longer simply surviving in human-managed wetlands. It is now actively supported by systems of control that are becoming more refined with every generation. The landscape itself starts to look less accidental. You're entering the earliest phases of engineered rice agriculture. The air here feels different again, still humid, still heavy with moisture, but now it carries the presence of structured labour. You hear repetitive sounds of digging tools, striking soil, wooden paddles moving water, and voices coordinating work across fields. This is no longer isolated subsistence, it is organised effort. A well-established archaeological interpretation shows that early paddy systems emerged when communities began intentionally controlling water depth to optimise rice growth, marking one of the first large-scale environmental modifications in human history. But here, there is no concept of engineering yet. There is only trial, error, and accumulated memory. You step into one of these early flooded fields. The water is shallow and deliberately contained. Mud buns form irregular boundaries, holding water in place like fragile walls. The rice plants are denser now, more consistent in height and spacing. They are not uniform in a modern sense, but they are clearly guided. You feel the ground shift slightly under your feet. Each step disturbs the water, sending small ripples outward that reflect fragments of sky and surrounding vegetation. The smell is richer here, a blend of wet clay, decaying plant matter, and something faintly sweet from growing grain. This is where rice begins to transform landscapes, not just occupy them. You notice that people are no longer simply reacting to nature, they are reshaping it in small, deliberate ways. Channels are dug to guide water flow. Elevated ridges are reinforced with compacted soil. Some areas are deliberately flooded while others are kept slightly drier. This creates a controlled ecosystem where rice gains an advantage over competing plants. A mainstream historical conclusion in agricultural anthropology suggests that paddy cultivation dramatically increased yield stability compared to dry farming systems, enabling denser populations and more permanent settlements. But the lived reality here is still fragile. A broken bund, a heavy rain, or a delayed planting can undo months of work. You watch a group repairing a damaged section of field edge. Hands press wet soil into place. The material is soft but resistant, slowly forming shape under pressure. There is patience in the movement, a recognition that control over water is never absolute. Nearby, seedlings are being transplanted. This is an important shift. Instead of scattering seeds randomly, young rice plants are carefully moved from one area to another. It is slow work. Fingers dip into mud, gently separating fragile shoots and placing them into aligned rows. The repetition creates rhythm, almost meditative in nature. A lesser-known agricultural insight is that transplanting rice seedlings allowed early farmers to improve spacing efficiency and reduce competition among plants, significantly increasing yields over time. But here, it is not understood as optimization. It is simply what works better after countless seasons of observation. You walk along the edge of the field and notice how the surrounding environment is changing too. Wild grasses are being pushed back. Certain insects become more common. Drawn by the standing water, birds gather at the edges, waiting for opportunities. Rice fields are becoming entire ecosystems. Now you begin to sense something subtle in human behavior. Work is no longer purely individual, it is coordinated. Groups move in patterns, timing becomes shared knowledge. One person's delay affects the entire field. Rice has introduced interdependence into daily life. There is also an emerging sense of planning beyond immediate survival. People begin to think in cycles, not just today's food, but next season's yield, not just this harvest, but storage for uncertain months ahead. Time begins to stretch in the human mind. A widely accepted view in early agrarian studies suggests that the development of irrigation-based rice cultivation played a crucial role in shifting human societies from short-term subsistence thinking to long-term resource planning. But in this moment, it is still grounded in lived necessity rather than abstract strategy. You crouch beside a storage area. Clay vessels and woven containers hold harvested rice. The grain is dry now, golden and dense in texture. When you touch it, it feels completely different from the living plant. It is quiet, stable, and final in a way growing rice never is. A quirky observation from ethnographic records notes that in some early societies, stored rice was treated almost like a living reserve, with rituals or careful handling practices reflecting its importance beyond simple food storage. Even here, you can sense that grain is beginning to carry meaning beyond nutrition. As evening approaches, the fields take on a reflective quality. Water mirrors the fading sky. Workers move slowly along the bunds, checking edges and ensuring water levels remain stable overnight. There is a calm discipline in these actions, as if the land itself demands constant attention. You notice how sound changes at this hour. The intensity of labour fades. What remains is ambient life. Frogs return to prominence. Insects fill the air with steady rhythm. The human presence becomes quieter but not absent. A mainstream historical fact highlights that rice agriculture, especially in flooded systems, enabled some of the highest population densities in early human settlements due to its productivity per land area. But what matters more here is how it reshapes daily rhythm. Life is no longer random, it is scheduled by water and growth. There is still debate among researchers about whether early paddy systems emerged gradually from wild wetland management, or whether they represent a more abrupt technological leap in human environmental control. And here, you can see both possibilities merging into one slow continuum. You walk one final time along the edge of the fields. The sky deepens into dark blue. Lantern-like reflections shimmer in the water. The rice plants sway gently, not with wind alone, but with the weight of their own growth and the presence of human care. And in this quiet moment, you understand something fundamental. Rice is no longer just a plant humans discovered. It is becoming a system that organizes how humans live, move, and think about survival itself. You move forward again, and the landscape slowly widens into something more complex, more layered, and more socially dense. Rice is no longer just shaping fields and water. It is now shaping entire communities, influencing how people organize themselves, how they distribute labor, and how they define belonging. The air feels busier here, not louder in a chaotic sense, but filled with constant human presence. Smoke rises from multiple cooking fires. Paths between houses are more defined. The edges of rice fields are no longer isolated working zones. They are integrated into settlement life itself. You are now standing in early agrarian societies where rice has become the backbone of daily existence. A widely accepted archaeological understanding suggests that rice cultivation contributed directly to the rise of permanent villages in several parts of Asia, because reliable harvest cycles reduced the need for constant migration. But here, there is no concept of agriculture theory. There is only the lived reality of staying in one place because the land now reliably feeds you. You walk through a settlement that sits close to flooded fields. Houses are simple but increasingly stable, built with wood frames, mud walls, and thatched roofs. They are not temporary shelters anymore. They are becoming long-term structures. The presence of rice makes permanence possible. Inside one of these homes, you see stored grain carefully organized in woven baskets and clay containers. The texture of rice here is dry, dense, and almost silent. It contrasts sharply with the wet, living fields outside. This separation between growing rice and stored rice is becoming one of the most important distinctions in human life. A mainstream historical fact in early economic anthropology highlights that surplus grain storage was a foundational step in the development of social hierarchy, trade systems, and early governance structures. But at this stage, hierarchy is still subtle, forming through access, knowledge, and control rather than formal institutions. You notice how certain individuals within the community begin to hold more influence, not because of force, but because of knowledge. Those who understand water timing, planting cycles, and harvest management become essential. Their expertise shapes collective survival. There is a quiet shift happening in how labour is organised. Work in the fields is increasingly coordinated. Groups move together with defined roles. Some prepare seedlings, others manage water channels, others focus on harvesting. This division is not so rigid yet, but it is becoming recognisable. A lesser-known anthropological observation notes that early rice-based societies often developed cooperative labour systems because irrigation and transplanting required synchronised effort. One household working alone would struggle, but coordinated groups could transform entire landscapes. You step into the fields again. The rice here is healthier, more predictable, rows are clearer, water levels are more controlled. The bunds that hold water are stronger and more carefully maintained. There is intention in every direction you look. The smell is familiar now, but deeper. Wet earth, green vegetation, and the faint organic sweetness of growing grain. It's a scent that signals stability, not luxury, not excess, but reliability. You observe planting activity. Seedlings are carefully spaced. The act is slow, repetitive, and deeply physical. Hands move rhythmically through water and mud. Each placement is deliberate. Each movement contributes to a shared outcome that will only be visible months later. A quirky detail often noted in ethnographic studies is that rice transplanting fields may have created early forms of synchronized labor rhythms. where groups unconsciously developed coordinated movements similar to choreographed work patterns. You can feel that rhythm here. Even without formal instruction, children move along the edges of the fields, observing and imitating. They are not formally taught. They absorb through repetition and proximity. Knowledge is embedded in daily life, not separated from it. A child who grows up near rice fields understands water, soil, and timing in a way that becomes instinctive. Now you begin to see something deeper forming. Rice is not only feeding people, it is shaping memory. It creates shared seasonal experiences that bind communities together. Every year, the same cycle returns: preparation, planting, growth, harvest, storage, and then waiting again. A mainstream historical interpretation suggests that agricultural cycles like rice cultivation played a key role in the development of early cultural calendars and seasonal rituals, as human life became increasingly synchronized with environmental rhythms. But here, those rhythms are still lived rather than recorded. You sit at the edge of a field during late afternoon. The light is softer now, reflecting off water in broken patterns. The surface of the field looks almost like a fragmented mirror, constantly shifting with small movements of wind and insects. Nearby, people discuss harvest expectations. The conversation is calm but serious. They are not guessing randomly. They are reading the land, interpreting water levels, plant health, and weather signs. Agriculture has become a form of environmental reading. There is also growing awareness of risk. Floods can destroy entire fields. Droughts can reduce yields dramatically. Pest outbreaks can spread quickly through wet environments. Rice provides stability, but it is not invincible. This balance between abundance and vulnerability shapes decision-making. A widely recognized historical conclusion in agrarian studies is that rice-based irrigation systems increased productivity, but also increased dependence on environmental stability and collective maintenance, making societies more interconnected and interdependent. But in this moment, that interdependence is simply life. You notice small social exchanges happening between households. Grain is shared, labor is exchanged, tools are borrowed. These interactions build relationships that are not formalized but deeply important. Rice surplus allows generosity to exist in ways that were previously difficult. There is a subtle transformation in time perception. People think less in terms of immediate survival and more in seasonal cycles. Conversations often reference next harvest or after the rains. Time becomes layered, stretched across agricultural expectation. A lesser-known scholarly insight in early agrarian research suggests that rice cultivation may have contributed to the development of long-term planning cognition in human societies, as survival became linked to delayed outcomes rather than immediate gathering. In this environment, patience is not optional, it is structural. As night begins to settle, you see smoke rising again from cooking fires. The smell of cooked rice drifts through the air. It is simple but grounding. Steam rises from bowls, carrying warmth into the cool evening air. The act of eating is no longer random scavenging. It is the result of coordinated effort, shared labor, and environmental management. You sit quietly in this moment. The settlement is calm but alive. Dogs move between houses. Water channels reflect faint starlight. Rice fields rest under darkness, holding the memory of months of work within them. And you realize something important. Rice is no longer just part of survival. It has become the structure around which survival is organized. It defines where people live, how they work, and how they relate to each other. As the night deepens, the entire world feels gently anchored by water, soil, and grain. You move deeper into the evolving world of rice, and something subtle changes in the atmosphere around you. The fields are no longer just productive spaces, they are becoming sacred in a quiet, unspoken way. Not yet formal religion, not yet structured belief systems, but something closer to emotional gravity tied to land, water, and repetition. The air feels softer here at dawn. Mist rises slowly from flooded paddies, curling across the surface like breath held by the earth itself. Birds move low over the water, leaving ripples of sound rather than just ripples in space. Everything feels slower, more attentive, as if the landscape itself is listening. You are now in a world where rice has begun to acquire meaning beyond survival. A well-established historical understanding in early cultural anthropology notes that staple crops often become embedded in symbolic systems once they stabilize food security, and rice is one of the clearest examples of this transformation. But here, you are not reading about symbolism. You are standing in the moment where meaning begins to form. You walk along the edge of a field where early rituals are taking shape. Small offerings are placed near water channels, not elaborate structures, just simple gestures, a handful of grains left at the edge of a bund. A quiet pause before planting begins. These actions are not standardized, they are felt. The rice fields themselves seem to amplify this sense of presence. Water reflects sky and movement, creating a constantly shifting surface that feels almost responsive. When wind passes through, the entire field shimmers like a living body. A widely recognized interpretation in agricultural history suggests that early rice-growing societies often associated water-controlled environments with fertility and continuity, leading to symbolic practices centered around cycles of growth and renewal. Yet in this moment, no one is articulating theory. They are simply responding to what feels significant. You crouch beside a small group preparing seedlings. Their hands move with familiarity. The mud is cool, dense, and grounding. Each plant is placed with care, not rushed. There is a sense that this work is not only about food production, but about maintaining balance between human action and natural rhythm. Children watch quietly nearby. They are not formally instructed, yet they understand timing, patience, and repetition through observation. Knowledge here is embedded in motion rather than language. A lesser-known ethnobotanical observation notes that rice cultivation often fosters strong intergenerational knowledge transfer because the entire process is seasonal and repetitive, allowing children to learn through immersion rather than structured teaching. You can see that process unfolding around you. Now you begin to notice subtle variations in how different groups interact with rice fields. Some communities treat the fields with utilitarian focus, emphasizing efficiency. Others incorporate more reflective or symbolic pauses into their routines. These differences are not rigid cultural categories yet, but early patterns of diversity are forming. You step into one of these fields. The water is still shallow, but carefully controlled. Bunds are reinforced, not perfectly shaped, but increasingly intentional. The rice plants are thriving, their density greater than earlier stages. The field feels stable, almost self-contained. A mainstream historical fact in early agrarian development highlights that rice cultivation significantly increased, carrying capacity of land compared to many dry farming systems, enabling higher population densities in river basins across Asia. But here, that fact is not abstract. It is visible in the number of people working, living and gathering around these fields. You hear conversation drifting across the water. It is calm, rhythmic, tied to tasks, discussions about water levels, planting timing, and expected yields blend seamlessly with everyday talk. There is no separation between life and agriculture anymore. Historians still debate whether early rice-based societies developed symbolic agricultural practices primarily as spiritual interpretations of environmental dependence or as social mechanisms to reinforce cooperation during labor-intensive cultivation. Standing here, you can feel both possibilities existing at once. As midday light intensifies, the fields become brighter, almost reflective. The water acts like a mirror, scattering sunlight into fragmented patterns across mud and plants. The heat presses gently on the surface of the earth, slowing movement slightly. Work continues, but with measured pace. You notice a group repairing a water channel. The action is careful and coordinated. They adjust flow direction by reshaping small sections of earth. This is not just maintenance, it is continuous negotiation with the environment. Water is never fully controlled, only guided. A quirky observation from early agricultural ethnography suggests that in some rice-growing regions, seasonal field maintenance became socially significant events where entire communities participated in shared labour, reinforcing group identity through synchronized environmental interaction. You can feel that collective rhythm here. As the day progresses, you see how rice fields influence settlement layout. Homes are positioned to minimize distance to water access points. Pathways between fields and dwellings are well worn. Storage areas are placed strategically to reduce labor effort during harvest periods. Everything begins to organize itself around the grain. There is also an emotional dimension emerging. People check fields not only for the practical reasons, but with a sense of attentiveness that borders on care. A plant bending differently, a change in water clarity, a patch of uneven growth will draw notice. Rice is being watched in a sustained way. A widely accepted conclusion in early agricultural studies suggests that rice cultivation contributed to the development of heightened environmental awareness in human societies. A survival depended on careful observation of ecological detail. But here, it feels less like awareness and more like relationship. You sit quietly at the edge of a bund as afternoon light softens again. The soundscape is layered, water movement, insects, distant voices, and the occasional rustle of rice stalks in wind. It is not silence, but it is calm. In this moment, rice is no longer just a crop, no longer just a survival mechanism. It is a shared structure of attention between humans and landscape. And as evening approaches once more, you understand that something profound has occurred without ceremony or announcement. A grain has begun shaping not only bodies and settlements, but also the way humans perceive time, effort, and meaning itself. You move forward again, and the world of rice begins to widen beyond individual river valleys and familiar settlements. What once felt like localized survival systems is now becoming a network of exchange, movement, and gradual connection between distant communities. The grain is no longer only growing in fields. It is moving through hands, baskets, and memory across regions. The air feels more dynamic here. You are not in a single place anymore, but in a corridor of movement. Footpaths stretch along rivers. Canoes cut through slow water channels. Small groups travel with carefully wrapped bundles of grain. Carrying something that is both food and future, you are now witnessing rice entering the world of early exchange systems. A well-supported historical interpretation in economic archaeology suggests that staple crops like rice played a foundational role in the emergence of early trade networks, because surplus food enabled exchange beyond immediate survival needs. But here, nothing feels like trade in a formal sense. It feels like trust carried over distance. You walk alongside a group moving through a humid lowland route. Their pace is steady, not rushed. They carry rice seeds in woven containers lined with natural fibers to protect them from moisture. Every step is careful because what they carry is not just grain, but continuity. The landscape shifts as you move. Riverbanks become more complex, with branching waterways and interconnected wetlands. These environments are ideal for rice, but also challenging to navigate. Water defines movement. Land appears and disappears depending on season and rainfall. A mainstream historical fact in early agricultural diffusion studies notes that rice spread across Asia through a combination of migration, exchange, and environmental adaptation, rather than a single directional expansion. Yet here, you are not observing a process. You are moving through it. You reach a small settlement where rice varieties from different regions are being compared. The plants are not identical. Some grow taller, some mature faster, some tolerate different water conditions. Farmers observe these differences carefully, selecting what performs best in their specific environment. This is where diversity begins to become strength. A lesser-known agricultural observation suggests that early rice cultivation involved multiple localized adaptations rather than a single uniform domestication path, resulting in a wide range of varieties suited to different ecological zones. Standing here, that diversity is visible in every field. You kneel at the edge of a newly planted plot. The soil is slightly different here, less dense, more mixed with sand and organic matter. Water behaves differently too, draining in some areas while pooling in others. Rice is still growing, but not without adjustment. People here are experimenting continuously. They test planting depth, they adjust spacing, they shift water levels. There is no fixed manual. Knowledge exists in action, not in instruction. Now you notice something important about movement. Rice is not only spreading through space, it is also spreading through social connection. Marriage ties, seasonal gatherings, and shared labor events all contribute to the movement of seeds and techniques between communities. A widely recognized conclusion in cultural diffusion studies highlights that agricultural knowledge often spreads through social relationships rather than formal instruction systems, especially in pre-literate societies. But here, that idea becomes tangible. You can see it happening in everyday interaction. You sit with a group exchanging seeds from different harvests. There is discussion, comparison, and curiosity. Seeds are examined by touch and appearance. Decisions are made slowly, based on experience rather than measurement. Trust plays a central role in what is exchanged. A quirky detail from ethnobotanical records notes that in some early agricultural communities, seed exchange was accompanied by small gestures of reciprocity, reinforcing social bonds while ensuring genetic diversity in crops. You can feel that social layer embedded in every exchange. As you continue traveling through these connected regions, you begin to notice how rice influences settlement placement more broadly. Communities cluster near reliable water sources. Seasonal migration patterns begin to shorten. Some groups begin staying in semi-permanent locations because rice reduces the need for constant movement. The landscape itself becomes structured around water management potential. Lowlands are carefully observed, floodplains are assessed for suitability. Even small changes in elevation matter. Rice has introduced a new way of reading geography. A mainstream historical fact in settlement archaeology suggests that the spread of rice agriculture contributed significantly to the stabilization of early human populations in river valleys and deltas, supporting the gradual rise of more complex social organization. But here, it is not complexity that stands out. It is continuity. You notice how storage practices are evolving. Rice is being kept in larger communal containers. Protection from moisture, pests, and spoilage becomes more sophisticated. Some storage areas are slightly elevated to avoid flooding. Others are reinforced with clay walls. This shift is crucial, because once rice can be reliably stored, it becomes something more than seasonal food. It becomes security across time. Historians still argue whether early surplus storage systems primarily emerged as communal safety strategies or whether they quickly became tools for emerging social differentiation. Standing here, both interpretations feel present in the way access to stored grain is managed. You walk into a storage area. The smell is dry and earthy, very different from the fields. Inside, rice is quiet. It no longer grows, no longer responds to weather. It simply exists as potential energy, waiting to be used. Outside, life continues in cycles. Fields are planted, tended, and harvested in repetition. But now those cycles are connected across communities. One group's harvest supports another group's planting. Exchange creates balance between regions. A lesser-known anthropological insight suggests that early agricultural exchange networks often functioned as risk distribution systems, allowing communities to buffer against localized crop failures by sharing surplus across regions. You can sense that logic forming here naturally. As afternoon light fades, you observe people returning from fields carrying tools and bundles of harvested grain. Movement is steady and familiar. There is fatigue, but also satisfaction. Work is not ending. It is simply transitioning into another stage. Children run along paths between settlements, carrying messages or small items. Their movement reflects the growing interconnectedness of these communities. Nothing is isolated anymore. Everything is linked through rice, water, and shared labour. You sit by a river as evening arrives. The surface reflects the sky in shifting patterns. Canoes pass slowly, carrying grain. Grain downstream. The sound of water becomes the dominant rhythm again. In this moment, you understand that rice is no longer just a cultivated plant. It has become a medium of connection, binding communities across distance through shared dependence on water systems and seasonal cycles. And as night begins to settle, you realize the world is no longer made of separate settlements. It is becoming a connected landscape shaped quietly by a single grain. You move forward again, and the world feels increasingly organized around repetition that is no longer just agricultural, but cultural. Rice is still in the fields, still in the water, still in the hands of farmers. But now it is also in meaning systems that begin to extend beyond survival. The grain has entered identity. The air is calmer here, but more structured in feeling. You notice patterns in daily life that are no longer purely reactive to weather or soil. There is rhythm, almost like an invisible schedule shaped by planting cycles. Morning activity begins at predictable times. Work in the fields follows a familiar sequence. Even rest seems synchronized with agricultural needs. You are now in early societies where rice is becoming part of the identity and governance structures. A well-established conclusion in historical anthropology suggests that staple crops often become central to the formation of early administrative systems because they allow predictable taxation and resource planning. But here, there is no bureaucracy yet. Instead, there is shared expectation shaped by harvest cycles. You walk into a settlement where rice fields are not just nearby but fully integrated into the spatial design of the community. Houses face toward water channels. Storage structures are positioned to minimize distance from harvest zones. Paths between homes and fields are worn deep into the soil. The smell here is familiar but layered. Freshly harvested rice mixes with smoke from cooking fires and the damp scent of irrigation canals. It is a smell of continuity rather than novelty. You observe a gathering near a central open area. People are discussing distribution of grain after harvest. There is no written record, but there is memory, reputation, and trust. Elders speak with quiet authority, not because of force, but because of accumulated experience in managing cycles of abundance and shortage. A mainstream historical fact in early political economy studies highlights that surplus grain management often contributed to the emergence of leadership roles in agrarian societies, as coordination of resources became essential for survival. But here, leadership is still fluid, based on situational trust rather than formal authority. You notice how rice harvests are becoming collective events with structured participation. Certain groups are responsible for cutting, others for bund repair, others for transport and storage. The work is physically demanding, but also socially binding. Everyone depends on everyone else. A lesser-known ethnographic observation suggests that communal harvest systems often strengthen social cohesion because shared labour creates repeated cycles of cooperation under time pressure. You can feel that cohesion in every coordinated movement across the field. You step into the harvest area itself. The rice plants are mature now, golden and heavy with grain. The water level has been partially reduced, exposing soft mud beneath. The air is warmer, thicker with the scent of ripe vegetation and drying stalks. Hands move quickly but carefully through the plants. Cutting tools are simple, made of sharpened stone or bone. The sound of harvesting is rhythmic, almost meditative. Each cut releases a soft rustle, followed by the gathering of stalks into bundles. Now you begin to notice something important. Rice is no longer just a plant cycle, it is becoming a social calendar. Life is structured around planting and harvest seasons. Other activities are adjusted to fit within these agricultural windows. A widely accepted interpretation in agricultural history suggests that rice cultivation contributed significantly to the development of seasonal time awareness in early societies. As survival depended on anticipating environmental cycles, but here, time is not abstract, it is felt through the body and labour. You walk through piles of harvested rice laid out to dry in open areas. The grains are spread across woven mats, exposed to sunlight and wind. The transformation from living plant to stored food is visible in stages around you. Children help by turning grain gently, preventing moisture buildup. Older individuals inspect quality. Everyone has a role, even if small. Knowledge flows through participation rather than instruction. A quirky detail noted in some early agrarian studies is that rice drying and storage practices often became informal social spaces where conversation, storytelling, and knowledge exchange occurred naturally during repetitive labour. You can sense that social layer forming here. As the day progresses, attention shifts from harvesting to storage. Grain is carried in baskets, balanced carefully to avoid spillage. Storage structures are filled gradually, with attention to protection from moisture and pests. You notice that access to stored grain is carefully monitored, not in an oppressive way, but in a controlled and organised manner. This is where rice begins to influence social structure more directly. Whoever manages storage holds responsibility for community stability. Historians still debate whether early grain storage systems led primarily to cooperative governance models, or whether they quickly created early forms of inequality based on control of surplus. Standing here, both possibilities feel present in the same space. You sit near a storage structure as evening approaches. Inside, rice is stacked in containers, silent and dense. Outside, the community gathers for shared meals. The contrast between stored abundance and immediate consumption becomes clear. Cooking is simple but central. Rice is boiled in clay vessels over open fire. Steam rises into the cooling air, carrying warmth and comfort. The act of eating together reinforces shared dependence on the harvest that just occurred. A mainstream historical fact in nutritional anthropology highlights that stable carbohydrate sources like rice significantly increase population resilience and energy availability in agrarian societies, supporting larger and more stable communities. But here, it feels more immediate. It feels like continuity between people. You notice conversations during the meal are calm, reflective. People talk about fields, water levels, weather changes, and future expectations. There is always a sense of looking forward to the next cycle. A lesser-known cultural observation suggests that repetitive agricultural cycles often shape collective memory in societies. As shared seasonal experiences create long-term cultural continuity, rice is doing exactly that here. It is embedding rhythm into memory. As night falls, the settlement becomes quieter. Fires burn lower. Fields rest under moonlight. Water channels reflect faint light, creating soft moving patterns across the ground. You walk along a bund one final time. The rice fields are still, but not empty. They hold the memory of labour, cooperation, and expectation. Every part of the landscape feels connected to human presence. And in this moment, You understand that rice is no longer simply feeding communities. It is organizing their time, shaping their relationships, and quietly forming the foundations of structured society. You move forward again, and the world feels more settled, more layered with permanence. What once were loose clusters of rice-growing communities are now beginning to resemble structured societies. Not yet empires, not yet kingdoms in the formal sense, but something unmistakably more organized than before. Rice is no longer just shaping survival, it is shaping systems. The air here feels denser with human coordination. You hear not just the sounds of farming, but the sounds of management. Conversations about allocation, storage, water access, and labor timing echo across settlements. The landscape itself feels administered, as if every patch of water and soil has a purpose assigned to it. You are now entering a phase where rice becomes the foundation of early economic organization. A widely accepted perspective in early economic history suggests that surplus grain production was one of the key conditions that allowed societies to develop structured governance, taxation, and labor coordination. But here, none of those systems exist in formal language. They exist in practice, in repetition, and in shared necessity. You walk through a settlement that has clearly grown in size compared to earlier periods. Houses are closer together. Storage facilities are more prominent. Paths are more organized, forming predictable routes between residential areas and fields. The rice fields themselves extend farther, connected by irrigation channels that feel increasingly deliberate. The smell of this place is richer and more complex than before. It is a mix of cooked rice, damp earth, smoke from continuous fires, and the faint metallic scent of waterlogged soil. It is not simply agricultural anymore, it is systemic. You observe how rice storage is now becoming a central concern. Dedicated spaces are built slightly elevated, protected from flooding. Containers are more carefully designed. Some are sealed with clay or woven tightly to reduce moisture exposure. These small improvements reflect an increasing understanding of long-term preservation. A mainstream historical conclusion in agrarian development research highlights that reliable food storage systems were essential in enabling early population growth and settlement stability, particularly in rice-based economies. But here, storage is not just infrastructure, it is responsibility. You notice a group managing distribution of grain after harvest. The process is structured but still socially negotiated. There is discussion, agreement, and sometimes quiet disagreement. Allocation depends on contribution, need, and communal expectation. Nothing is purely individual anymore. A lesser-known anthropological insight suggests that early grain-based societies often developed complex informal systems of reciprocity, where food distribution was guided as much by social obligation as by physical availability. You can feel that balance shaping every interaction here. You step into the fields again. Rice cultivation has become more refined. Water levels are carefully adjusted through interconnected channels. Bunds are reinforced with greater consistency. Plant spacing is more controlled. The fields feel less experimental and more stable. The rice itself appears healthier and more uniform than in earlier stages, not identical, but clearly shaped by a continuous selection and human management. The plants stand in dense clusters, swaying gently with wind moving across shallow water. Now you begin to see labor specialization emerging more clearly. Some individuals focus primarily on irrigation control. Others specialize in planting techniques. Others handle harvesting and storage. This division is not rigid, but it is becoming recognizable across the community. A widely recognized interpretation in early social evolution studies suggests that agricultural intensification, especially in rice systems, contributed to the gradual development of specialized labor roles and early administrative structures. But here, it is still embedded in daily life rather than formal hierarchy. You notice how decisions about water are particularly important. Irrigation timing determines productivity. Small adjustments in channels can affect entire fields. Water is no longer just a natural presence, it is a managed resource. A quirky observation from historical agricultural studies notes that rice irrigation systems often required continuous communal maintenance, which inadvertently reinforced social cohesion and interdependence among farming groups. You can see that maintenance happening all around you. As midday approaches, the fields become bright and reflective. Sunlight bounces off shallow water, creating shimmering patterns that move with wind and footsteps. The environment feels almost alive with light and motion. You sit at the edge of a field where planting is underway. Seedlings are carefully placed into rows. The process is slow but steady. Each movement contributes to a future harvest that will not be seen for months. Children observe from nearby, learning through repetition. Their understanding of rice is not taught in structured lessons. It is absorbed through presence. They already know when water must be checked, when plants should be observed, and when harvest approaches. A mainstream historical fact in agricultural sociology highlights that rice-based economies often foster strong intergenerational knowledge transfer due to the repetitive and seasonal nature of cultivation cycles. But here, it is simply how life is learned. You notice subtle signs of social coordination becoming more formalized. Certain individuals are consistently involved in decision-making around fields and resources, while there is no formal state structure yet. Patterns of authority are becoming clearer. Historians still debate whether early rice-based governance emerged from egalitarian cooperation or whether it quickly evolved into structured hierarchies driven by control of water and grain resources. Standing here, both interpretations feel present in the same lived reality. As the day progresses, attention shifts from fieldwork to maintenance, channels are cleaned, bunds are repaired, tools are shared and adjusted. The work never fully stops, it simply changes form. You walk along a main irrigation channel that connects multiple fields. Water flows slowly but steadily, guided by human-made boundaries. It reflects sky, plants, and movement, creating a continuous visual thread through the landscape. A lesser-known ecological observation suggests that rice paddies function as semi-artificial wetlands, supporting both agricultural productivity and localized biodiversity, creating unique ecological systems shaped by human intervention. You can sense that duality in the environment. As evening arrives, the settlement becomes calmer again. Cooking fires begin to glow. Rice is prepared in larger communal pots. The scent spreads through the air, soft and grounding. People gather in small groups, sharing food and conversation. The mood is not celebratory in a loud sense. It is steady, reflective, and familiar. The rhythm of agricultural life has created a sense of predictability that anchors daily existence. A widely accepted conclusion in early economic anthropology suggests that rice cultivation played a central role in stabilizing food systems, enabling societies to shift from survival-based living to more structured forms of social organization. But here, that shift is not abstract, it is lived every day. You sit quietly as night begins to fall. The fields outside the settlement rest under dim light. Water channels reflect faint stars. The entire landscape feels organized, not by force, but by repetition and care. And in this moment, you realize something fundamental. Rice is no longer just feeding people or organizing labor. It's becoming the invisible framework through which society itself begins to take shape. You move forward again, and the world of rice begins to stretch across wider horizons. What once felt like contained river-valley systems now expands into multiple ecological zones, each adapting the grain in slightly different ways. Rice is no longer just a local foundation, it is becoming a regional force. The air here feels varied, almost as if you are moving through multiple climates in a single journey. Humid lowlands transition into slightly drier uplands, then back into wet basins. Everywhere water appears. Rice finds a possibility, but not always in the same form. The grain is adapting as it travels. You are now entering regions where rice is evolving into different ecological expressions, especially upland, and rain-fed systems. A widely accepted conclusion in agricultural geography suggests that rice cultivation diversified into multiple environmental adaptations early in its spread, allowing it to thrive in both flooded paddies and non-irrigated upland fields. But here, this is not classification. It is experimentation driven by necessity. You walk through an upland settlement where rice fields are not submerged but rely entirely on rainfall. The soil is lighter, more porous, and less predictable. Water is not stored in bunds, but absorbed directly from seasonal skies. The rhythm of cultivation is more fragile here. The smell is different too, less aquatic, more earthy and dry. You notice the absence of standing water changes everything. There are fewer reflections, fewer shimmering surfaces. Instead, the landscape feels more textured, more exposed. Farmers here observe the sky constantly. Rain is not just weather, it is timing. Planting depends on anticipation of seasonal shifts. Mistakes carry heavier consequences because water cannot be controlled or stored in the same way. A mainstream historical fact in agrarian ecology highlights that upland rice systems developed independently in several regions as communities adapted the crop to non-irrigated environments, demonstrating rice's extraordinary ecological flexibility. But here, flexibility is not a concept. It is survival strategy. You kneel in a field where rice grows less densely than in irrigated systems. The plants are more spread out, competing with natural grasses. Weeding is more important here. Without water control, the environment is less managed and more negotiated. You notice that labour patterns differ significantly. Instead of continuous water management, effort is concentrated around timing and protection. People guard fields more actively during early growth stages, watching for animals, pests, and unpredictable rainfall. A lesser-known agricultural observation suggests that rain-fed rice systems often required heightened ecological awareness, as farmers had to interpret environmental signals more precisely to ensure successful harvests. You can feel that attentiveness in every movement here. Now you begin to see rice not as a single system, but as a family of practices shaped by geography. In lowlands, it is water-controlled. In uplands, it is climate-responsive. In between, hybrid systems emerge, blending techniques from both. You move back toward wetter regions again, and the contrast becomes clear. Here, irrigation dominates once more, while the channels are more elaborate. Fields are more structured. The difference between regions is not just environmental, it is technological. A widely recognized interpretation in early agricultural diffusion studies suggests that rice spread encouraged innovation in water management systems, as communities adapted cultivation techniques to local hydrological conditions. But here, innovation is not planned, it is accumulated. You observe farmers adjusting irrigation flow between fields using simple gates made of wood and compacted earth. Small changes in water direction affect entire plots. The precision is not mechanical but experiential, learned through repeated seasons. Children still follow adults, but now they are exposed to multiple rice systems across different environments. This creates a broader understanding of cultivation as adaptable rather than fixed. Rice is not one method, it is many responses to water. A quirky detail noted in ethnographic agricultural records is that communities practicing multiple rice cultivation systems often developed a more complex understanding of seasonal variation, as they had to coordinate different planting strategies within overlapping ecological zones. You can sense that complexity here. As you travel further, you encounter settlements where rice begins to influence not just agriculture but early forms of exchange specialization. Certain groups focus on producing surplus grain, while others specialize in tools, pottery, or irrigation maintenance. The landscape reflects this specialization. Storage areas are larger and more organized. Transport routes are more frequently used. Canoes and footpaths connect settlements in increasingly predictable patterns. A mainstream historical fact in early economic anthropology highlights that agricultural surplus, especially from rice cultivation, enabled the development of exchange networks that supported craft specialization and early economic differentiation. But here, it is still grounded in everyday exchange rather than formal markets. You sit near a river crossing where goods are being moved between communities. Rice is central among them, exchanged alongside tools, textiles, and raw materials. There is conversation, negotiation, and shared understanding of value, though nothing is written. Now you begin to notice subtle changes in social structure. Some individuals consistently coordinate storage and distribution. Others manage irrigation systems across multiple fields. These roles are becoming more stable over time. Historians still debate whether early rice-based specialization naturally led to hierarchical systems or whether cooperative models remain dominant longer than often assumed in traditional interpretations. Standing here, you can see both cooperation and emerging differentiation coexisting. As afternoon light softens, the fields take on a reflective quality again. Water mirrors clouds and movement. The rice plants sway gently, creating layered textures of green and gold depending on stage of growth. You walk along a raised bund that connects multiple fields. It functions almost like a pathway through water. People use it constantly, carrying tools, seedlings, or harvested grain. Movement itself becomes structured by agricultural design. A lesser-known ecological insight suggests that rice-based landscapes function as engineered wetland systems that simultaneously support food production and environmental stability, creating long-term human-shaped ecosystems. You can feel that engineered balance in every step. As evening approaches, the rhythm of labor slows. Workers return from fields carrying tools over shoulders. Smoke rises again from scattered cooking fires. The smell of rice cooking spreads gently across the settlement. Meals are shared in groups. Conversations are calm and familiar. Topics revolve around fields, weather patterns, and expectations for the next cycle. There is no separation between daily life and agriculture. They are the same structure expressed in different forms. A widely accepted conclusion in agricultural history suggests that rice cultivation played a key role in stabilizing human settlements by creating predictable food systems tied to seasonal cycles, enabling more permanent habitation and social continuity. But here, that stability is still fragile, dependent on rain, labor, and cooperation. You sit quietly as night falls. The fields rest under dim light, water reflecting from stars. Everything feels connected through repetition and care. Even silence feels structured. And as you observe this expanding world, you realize rice is no longer just shaping communities. It is shaping how entire regions organize themselves around water, time, and shared survival. You move forward again, and the world of rice takes on a heavier tone. Not darker, but more complex, more entangled with systems of power, labor, and expansion. What once was a quiet relationship between people and wetlands has now become something scaled, managed, and intensified across growing populations. The air feels busier here, almost pressured. You sense movement not just of individuals, but of organized labor groups moving in coordinated cycles. Fields are larger, irrigation systems more interconnected, and storage sites more central to settlement life. Rice is no longer just sustaining communities, it is sustaining structures. You are now entering the era where rice cultivation expands under early large-scale coordination, edging towards systems that resemble proto-state agriculture. A widely recognized conclusion in agrarian history suggests that intensified rice production often correlates with the emergence of centralized coordination mechanisms for water management and surplus distribution. But here, there is no formal state. There is only increasing coordination that feels unavoidable as populations grow. You walk through fields that stretch farther than before. The geometry of cultivation is more visible. Bunds form repeated patterns across the landscape. Water is no longer simply guided. It is regulated through shared infrastructure that spans multiple farming zones. The smell is stronger here. Wet soil, dense vegetation, and continuous human activity create a layered atmosphere. There is less silence between actions. Even when people are not speaking, the environment feels active, maintained, and continuously adjusted. You observe labour groups working across different stages of rice production simultaneously. One group repairs irrigation channels upstream, another tends seedlings, another manages harvesting in adjacent plots. The coordination is not centralised in a visible authority, but it is clearly structured. A mainstream historical fact in agricultural systems research highlights that large-scale rice cultivation often required collective water management infrastructure, which in turn contributed to the development of more organised social coordination. But here, it feels like necessity rather than design. You kneel near a major irrigation channel. Water flows steadily through carefully maintained paths, branching into multiple fields. Small adjustments in flow direction are made using simple gates of wood and compacted earth. These adjustments are frequent and deliberate. Now you begin to sense something important. Water is no longer just a resource. It is a shared responsibility. Its control requires negotiation, cooperation, and timing that affects entire communities. A lesser-known ecological observation suggests that irrigated rice systems function as interconnected hydrological networks, where changes in one section directly influence productivity in others, forcing communities into continuous coordination. You can feel that interdependence in every movement around you. You walk into a settlement adjacent to these larger fields. The scale is noticeably greater. Storage areas are more prominent and centralized. Paths are wider and more frequently used. There is a sense of structured routine across daily life that was less visible in earlier sections. People here are not only farmers, they are participants in a larger system of production and distribution. Some focus on field management, others on storage, others on water regulation. These roles are becoming increasingly stable. A widely accepted interpretation in early economic anthropology suggests that rice-based surplus systems contributed significantly to the development of early administrative specialization, as managing grain and water required sustained coordination beyond household units. But here, specialization is still embedded in lived practice rather than formal titles. You notice how communication between groups is more frequent. Information about water levels, planting schedules, and harvest timing travels constantly. It is spoken, remembered, and repeated across settlements connected by shared irrigation networks. Now you see something more subtle emerging. Time itself feels more synchronized. Activities across different fields occur in coordinated sequences. Planting in one area depends on harvesting in another. Everything is linked. A quirky detail from agricultural ethnography notes that highly coordinated rice systems often lead to the emergence of shared seasonal rhythms across entire regions, effectively synchronizing daily life across large populations without written schedules. You can sense that synchronization here. You step into a harvesting zone where rice is being collected at scale. The golden fields move like waves as groups work through them systematically. Bundles are formed, carried, and transported along established routes towards storage centers. The soundscape is dense, Cutting tools, water movement, human voices, and distant activity from adjacent fields all overlap. It's not chaotic. It is layered coordination. You notice how storage now plays an even more critical role. Large communal facilities hold harvested grain. Distribution is managed carefully, not randomly. Access is regulated through shared agreements that balance contribution and need. A mainstream historical fact in early state formation studies highlights that control over surplus grain was often a foundational element in the emergence of administrative authority in agrarian societies. But here, authority is still distributed, though increasingly structured. You sit near a storage area. Inside, rice is stacked in organized layers. The air is dry compared to the fields. The contrast is striking. Outside is water and growth, inside is stability and delay. Children move between storage and fields carrying small tasks. They are part of the system from an early age. Learning is continuous and practical. There is no separation between education and labour. A lesser-known anthropological insight suggests that rice-based societies often develop strong intergenerational continuity because agricultural knowledge had to be transmitted through repeated seasonal participation. You can see that transmission happening everywhere around you. As afternoon fades, you walk along a major bund that connects multiple field zones. It is not just a boundary, it is infrastructure. People use it constantly for movement, transport, and coordination between areas. You notice that some sections of land are now designated for specific purposes: seed production, transplanting, storage access. And irrigation management are increasingly differentiated. The landscape itself is becoming organized. Historians still debate whether early rice-based administrative systems emerged gradually from cooperative irrigation maintenance or whether they were accelerated by population pressure and resource competition. Standing here, both forces feel present at once. As evening approaches, labour slows but does not stop entirely. Maintenance continues, water levels are checked, bunds are reinforced, grain is secured. The system does not rest completely, it only transitions between phases. You sit at the edge of a field watching sunlight fade across water surfaces. The reflections stretch and fragment as ripples move through irrigation channels. The entire landscape feels like a living mechanism shaped by repetition. A widely recognized conclusion in agricultural development studies suggests that intensive rice cultivation system played a key role in transforming human societies from loosely organized settlements into more structured, interconnected regions with shared resource management. But here, transformation is still ongoing, not complete. Night begins to settle. Fires appear across the settlement. Smoke rises into cooling air. The sound of water remains constant in the background, as it always does. And as you look across this expanding system of fields, channels, and settlements, you realize rice is no longer simply feeding communities. It is becoming the organizing principle of entire landscapes. You move forward again, and the scale of the world shifts once more. The rice systems you have been walking through are no longer just regional networks of coordination. They now begin to connect across vast distances, carried by rivers, coastline islands, and early maritime routes. What was once local adaptation is becoming long-range diffusion. The air feels different here, lighter in some places and saltier in others. You're no longer only inland, you are closer to coastal zones, estuaries, and delta systems where fresh water meets the sea. These environments are complex, unstable, and incredibly fertile when managed correctly. Rice finds new opportunities here. You're now witnessing rice entering broader interregional movement, especially through river, deltas, and early exchange corridors. A widely accepted view in historical geography suggests that rice spread into new ecological zones through a combination of migration, coastal exchange, and adaptation to delta environments, particularly where sediment-rich waters created highly fertile land. But here, there is no sense of expansion, only continuity across changing landscapes. You walk through a delta region where water behaves unpredictably. Rivers split into multiple channels. Land appears and disappears depending on season and sediment flow. Rice fields here are more intricate, shaped by constant adjustment to shifting water patterns. The smell is intensified. Brackish water mixes with freshwater soil. Vegetation is dense and layered. The air carries both freshness and decay, a reminder that this environment is always in motion. You observe farmers adapting rice cultivation to these dynamic conditions. Fields are not fixed in rigid geometry. Instead, they flex with the land. Bunds are reinforced more frequently. Channels are redirected as sediment builds up or erodes away. A mainstream historical fact in environmental archaeology highlights that river deltas became key centers of early rice intensification due to their nutrient-rich soils and high water availability, supporting larger yields compared to upland systems. But here, productivity is not stable. It must be constantly maintained. You kneel at the edge of a newly formed field in a shifting sediment zone. The soil feels different under your hands, softer, more fluid, less predictable. Rice still grows here, but only because human attention is constant. Now you notice how labor intensity increases in these environments. Maintenance is not seasonal, it is continuous. Water levels, soil stability, and bund integrity require ongoing adjustment. Rice cultivation here is not a cycle, it is a permanent engagement. A lesser-known ecological observation suggests that delta rice systems often required higher levels of communal coordination due to their unstable terrain, leading to more frequent collective labor interventions. You can see that collective effort shaping every visible surface. You move along a narrow, raised path between flooded plots. These paths are essential. Without them, movement would be impossible. People use them constantly to transport tools, seedlings, and harvested grain. The entire landscape is navigated through human-made elevation. Now you begin to see rice becoming part of larger movement systems. It is no longer just grown and consumed locally. It begins to travel further, carried along waterways by small boats and seasonal traders. A widely recognized conclusion in early economic history suggests that staple crops like rice played a crucial role in enabling early long-distance exchange systems by providing portable, storable food surpluses. But here, exchange is still personal. It is carried by individuals, not institutions. You sit near a river junction where small groups gather to exchange goods. Rice is central among them, alongside tools, salt, and woven materials. Conversations are careful, based on trust and repeated interaction. Value is understood through experience rather than measurement. A quirky observation from ethnographic research notes that in many early rice-growing societies, grain exchange was often embedded within social rituals that reinforced long-term relationships between communities, ensuring continuity of trade beyond immediate transactions. You can feel that relational layer in every exchange here. As you continue moving through these interconnected zones, you notice increasing specialization across regions. Some areas focus heavily on rice production, others focus on tools or transportation. Still others specialize in maintaining irrigation infrastructure that supports multiple communities. The landscape reflects this specialization. Certain fields are larger and more intensively managed. Others are reserved for seed production or experimental planting. Storage centers vary in size depending on regional output. A mainstream historical fact in early economic systems suggests that agricultural surplus and specialization were closely linked, with rice cultivation playing a central role in enabling non-agricultural labor roles to emerge in surrounding communities. But here, specialization is still fluid and adaptive. You step into a settlement that appears more connected to external routes than earlier ones. Movement is frequent. Boats arrive and depart regularly. Goods are exchanged continuously. Rice is one of the most common items moving through this network. Now you notice something subtle but important. Information begins to travel alongside goods. Knowledge about planting techniques, seasonal patterns, and water management spreads between communities just as seeds do. A lesser-known anthropological insight suggests that early agricultural networks often functioned as parallel systems of knowledge exchange, where farming techniques diffused alongside crop movement, creating regional convergence and cultivation methods. You can sense that convergence happening here. As afternoon light softens, the delta landscape becomes almost reflective. Water channels shimmer with layered colours. Rice fields appear fragmented but interconnected, like pieces of a larger system held together by constant adjustment. You walk along a raised embankment that connects multiple farming zones. People use it not only for movement but also for observation. From here, they monitor water levels across a wide area. The view itself becomes a tool of agriculture. Now you see rice shaping not just land use but perception. People begin to think in systems of water distribution, land stability, and seasonal flow. Their understanding of geography becomes functional and relational. A widely accepted interpretation in agricultural systems research suggests that rice-based irrigation landscapes contributed significantly to the development of systems thinking in early human societies, as survival depended on understanding interconnected environmental processes. But here, it is simply how people see their world. As evening arrives, activity slows but does not disappear. Maintenance continues in smaller groups. Water channels are checked, bunds are reinforced. Boats move slowly through fading light carrying grain and tools. You sit near the edge of a channel as night approaches. The water reflects dim sky tones. The sound of movement softens but remains present. Rice fields stretch into darkness, still active in subtle ways, and as you observe this expanding delta world, you realize rice is no longer just a crop moving across regions. It is becoming a connective tissue linking ecosystems, communities, and early exchange networks into a continuous living system. You move forward again, and the world of rice begins to feel less like scattered human adaptation and more like a fully matured system of environmental design. What you are entering now is not just expansion, but refinement. Every river valley, every delta, every irrigated plain is increasingly shaped by accumulated knowledge passed across generations. The air feels steady here, almost weighted with continuity. There is less experimentation and more confidence in the landscape. Water is guided with precision. Fields are laid out with intention. Even movement through settlements feels more predictable, as if everything has settled into long-established rhythm. You are now witnessing rice agriculture in a phase of advanced intensification and early scientific observation. A widely accepted interpretation in agricultural history suggests that as rice cultivation matured, societies began refining irrigation techniques, seed selection practices, and field organization to maximize yield stability and labor efficiency. But here, nothing feels theoretical. It feels like lived refinement built on centuries of repetition. You walk through a landscape where rice fields are now highly structured. Bunds are straighter, more durable. Water channels are interconnected in complex networks that distribute flow across large areas. The system is no longer just reactive to nature. It is actively maintained as a stable environmental architecture. The smell is familiar but deeper now. Wet soil, organic decay, and growing rice blend with smoke from continuous human presence. There is less seasonal interruption. Maintenance is ongoing throughout the year. You observe seed selection practices that have become more deliberate. Farmers examine harvested grain carefully, choosing seeds based on size, resilience, and consistency. This is not yet formal science, but it is systematic observation passed through generations of experience. A mainstream historical fact in agricultural genetics highlights that rice domestication involved long-term selection for traits beneficial to human harvesting and cultivation, including reduced grain shattering and synchronized maturation. But here, these traits are not explained. They are simply preferred outcomes repeatedly reinforced over time. You kneel beside a storage area where seeds are being prepared for the next planting cycle. The process is careful and methodical. Grain is sorted, cleaned, and stored in controlled conditions. There is attention to dryness, airflow, and protection from pests. Nothing is left to chance. Now you notice something important about knowledge. It is becoming more specialized. Certain individuals are recognized for their understanding of water systems, others for their expertise in seed quality, others for managing harvest logistics. Roles are becoming stable across generations. A lesser-known anthropological observation suggests that long-term agricultural societies often develop hereditary knowledge roles, not necessarily formalized as hierarchy, but maintained through continuous practice within families or community groups. You can feel that continuity here. You walk into fields that are now part of a large integrated irrigation network. Water flows through main channels into secondary and tertiary branches, distributing evenly across vast cultivated zones. The system requires constant coordination and shared understanding among multiple settlements. Now, rice is not just shaping individual fields, it is shaping entire regional infrastructures. A widely recognized conclusion in environmental archaeology suggests that intensive rice cultivation systems often led to the development of large-scale water management networks, which in turn required increasingly coordinated social organization. But here, coordination is still practical rather than institutional. You observe groups working on canal maintenance. Sediment is removed. Flow is adjusted, small structures are repaired. Every action is part of sustaining a system that no single group can manage alone. There is a strong sense of interdependence. If one section of the irrigation system fails, multiple fields are affected. This creates a shared responsibility that extends across communities. A quirky detail noted in agricultural ethnography is that rice irrigation maintenance often becomes a year-round activity in intensively farmed regions, blurring the boundary between farming seasons and infrastructure upkeep. You can see that blending clearly here. As you continue walking, you notice that settlement patterns are becoming more anchored. Villages are larger and more permanent. Storage buildings are more prominent. Some structures appear dedicated specifically to grain management and redistribution. Rice is no longer just food production. It is now central to settlement stability. You sit near a distribution area where harvested rice is being allocated. The process is organized but still based on local agreement and shared understanding. There is discussion, adjustment, and consensus building. Nothing is entirely rigid, yet patterns are clear. A mainstream historical fact in early political anthropology suggests that control over staple grain distribution often played a foundational role in the emergence of early governance systems in agrarian societies. But here, governance is still embedded in communal coordination rather than formal authority. Children move through these spaces constantly. Observing and participating in small tasks, they learn through repetition and proximity. Knowledge is not separated from life, it is embedded in it. Now you begin to see how rice shapes perception of time more deeply than before. Life is structured around planting, growth, harvest, and storage cycles, but these cycles are now interlinked across regions. Time feels synchronized over larger distances. A lesser-known cultural observation suggests that rice-based agricultural societies often develop shared seasonal frameworks across regions, creating aligned cycles of activity even without centralized coordination. You can sense that synchronization extending across the landscape. As afternoon light softens, the fields take on a layered appearance. Some areas are being prepared for planting while others are approaching harvest. Maintenance continues in adjacent zones. The entire system operates simultaneously at multiple stages of production. You walk along a raised irrigation boundary that offers a wide view of interconnected fields. From here, the scale of coordination becomes visible. Water flows, labour movements, and crop cycles form a continuous pattern across the land. Now rice is no longer just an agricultural practice, it is an organising logic that structures entire landscapes. A widely accepted interpretation into equal agricultural systems theory suggests that intensive rice cultivation contributed to the emergence of complex socio-ecological systems where human activity and environmental management became inseparable. But here, this integration is simply reality. As evening approaches, activity gradually slows, not because the system stops, but because it transitions. Water is checked, tools are stored, fields are monitored. The work continues in quieter forms. You sit at the edge of a canal as light fades across the water. Reflections of sky and vegetation shift gently with movement. The soundscape is calm but continuous, never fully silent. And in this moment, you understand something profound. Rice is no longer just feeding populations or organising labour. It has become the underlying structure through which entire regions coordinate water, time, and human cooperation. You move forward again, and the world of rice feels at its widest point yet. Everything you have seen before now converges into something vast, layered, and deeply interconnected. This is no longer the story of isolated regions, or even coordinated river systems. It is a global pattern forming quietly across continents, shaped by movement, adaptation, and human necessity. The air feels expansive here. You are no longer confined to a single ecological rhythm. Instead, you sense multiple climates overlapping in memory and geography. River deltas, monsoon regions, coastal plains, and irrigated valleys all echo through the same grain. Rice is now everywhere water allows life to settle. You're witnessing rice as a global agricultural foundation. A widely accepted conclusion in world agricultural history suggests that rice became one of the most important staple crops in human civilization due to its adaptability, high yield potential, and ability to support dense populations across diverse environments. But here, it is not a statistic. It is a lived structure beneath human life. You walk through a landscape that feels like a synthesis of everything before it. Fields are highly organised, irrigation systems deeply integrated, and settlements fully dependent on agricultural cycles that extend far beyond local boundaries. The scale is no longer regional. It is civilizational. The smell is layered in a way that feels almost timeless. Wet earth, cultivated grain, smoke from continuous human habitation, and distant traces of trade routes all blend together. It feels like the accumulated scent of thousands of years of interaction between humans and rice. You observe how rice now defines entire population centres. Cities and large settlements are positioned near fertile plains and controlled water systems. Movement of people, goods, and knowledge is increasingly shaped by where rice can be reliably grown. A mainstream historical fact in global economic development studies highlights that rice agriculture supported some of the highest pre-industrial population densities in human history due to its caloric efficiency and land productivity. But here, that efficiency is not abstract, it is visible in the density of life itself. You kneel beside a vast field system that stretches beyond immediate sight. Water flows through carefully maintained channels, feeding multiple sections of cultivation. Every part of the system is interconnected. A change in one area affects many others. Now you begin to see rice as infrastructure rather than simply agriculture. It is a system that organizes water, storage, and distribution across entire landscapes. A lesser-known ecological observation suggests that long-term rice cultivation creates semi-artificial wetland ecosystems that stabilize water flow. support biodiversity, and reshape natural hydrology into managed environmental systems. You can feel that transformation in every direction. You walk through a large settlement adjacent to these fields. It's no longer just a village, it has layers of specialization. Storage districts, labor zones, craft areas, and administrative spaces are loosely separated but connected. Movement between them is constant. Rice is the invisible logic behind all of it. You observe storage facilities that now function at large scale. Grain is collected, sorted, and redistributed across wide networks. Access is organized through systems of responsibility and record keeping, even when those records are still primarily oral or symbolic. A widely recognized interpretation in historical sociology suggests that surplus rice storage was one of the key factors enabling the development of early administrative institutions, as coordination of food resources required sustained oversight and structured distribution. But here, administration is still embedded in daily practice rather than formalized systems. You notice how people speak about harvest not just as events, but as obligations tied to larger cycles. There is an awareness that individual effort contributes to collective stability across entire regions. Now you begin to see something even larger forming. Rice is not only shaping societies, it is shaping how societies relate to time itself. Everything is organized around recurring cycles that extend across years and generations. A lesser-known anthropological insight suggests that staple crop systems like rice cultivation often lead to the development of long-range temporal thinking, where communities plan not just for immediate survival, but for multi-seasonal continuity. You can sense that expanded time horizon here. You walk along a major irrigation corridor that connects multiple settlement clusters. The scale is immense. Water is guided across long distances through carefully maintained channels, feeding fields far beyond immediate visibility. Now rice has become a shared infrastructure across entire regions. A quirky observation from environmental anthropology notes that large-scale irrigation systems often function as both ecological and social networks, requiring continuous human participation to maintain balance between water distribution and agricultural demand. You see that participation everywhere, constant and ongoing. As afternoon light shifts, the landscape becomes a layered mosaic of activity. Some fields are being harvested, others prepared for planting, others maintained. All stages exist simultaneously within the same system. You sit on a raised bund overlooking this vast network. From here, rice fields stretch in multiple directions, interrupted only by water channels and settlement clusters. The scale is quiet but overwhelming in its continuity. Now you begin to understand that rice is not just a crop, it is a framework that organizes human geography. A mainstream historical fact in global agricultural history highlights that rice cultivation enabled the development of some of the earliest and most stable agrarian civilizations due to its ability to support dense, sedentary populations with reliable food production. But here, what matters is not stability alone, but dependency. As evening approaches, labor slows into maintenance routines. Water is checked, channels are adjusted, storage is secured. Movement becomes less about production and more about preservation of balance. You notice how deeply synchronized the entire system has become, even without centralized command. Actions across settlements align with seasonal rhythms and environmental signals shaped by rice cultivation. Now everything feels connected through repetition, connected. You walk one final time along a canal edge, water reflects fading light. Rice fields extend into distance, no longer just agricultural zones, but living systems of coordination between humans and environment. And in this final moment, you understand the full transformation. Rice has moved from wild grass to cultivated plant, from local crop to regional system, and finally into a global foundation shaping population, economy, and time itself. It is no longer something humanity simply grows, It is something humanity now grows within. The world grows quiet as night settles over the fields. Water still flows, grain still rests, and human life continues, gently structured by the invisible architecture of rice. You do not need to follow the grain any further now. You can simply let it exist in your mind the way it has always existed in your life without you noticing. A quiet bowl on a table, a meal shared without thought, a harvest somewhere far away that you will never see but will always depend on. The journey of rice does not end in any single place, because it was never really a story about movement alone. It was a story about repetition, about water finding paths, about people learning patience through seasons they could not control, about survival slowly turning into structure, and structure slowly turning into habit. You might notice your thoughts slowing now, drifting a little. That is fine. Imagine the fields again, not as vast systems or history, but as simple surfaces of water under fading light, wind passing gently over them, nothing urgent remaining, nothing demanding attention. Everything the grain built still continues somewhere in the world. Even as you rest, rivers still carry sediment, fields still flood and drain, hands still plant and harvest in quiet cycles that do not need to be seen to continue. And you are no longer walking through history now. You are simply resting outside it, listening to the echo it leaves behind. Let your thoughts become lighter. Let the structure dissolve, let the water settle. There is nothing more to follow, only quiet continuity. Sleep can come easily here, where everything is already in rhythm. Sweet dreams.